Thanks, Jerry. Southern Vermont's really a good place to start with this conversation because it's a region that began preparing early for the closure, in their case, the Vermont Yankee nuclear power station, and because they took a very regional approach. So I think it's a very instructive kind of case to look at to begin this conversation about how to analyze the problem, how to prepare for mitigation, and so far to go forward. So I'm very pleased to be joined here by Chris Campany and Jen Stromsten. And Chris, I think I'm going to hand it to you first.
Great, thanks for pulling this together. I'm glad that this kind of activity is happening now, so that fewer people kind of have to blaze their own trail. Really appreciate the work that Marge Kilkelly and John Mullen did. It informed our need to prepare for the closure of Vermont Yankee, whenever that might have been, and whenever that might be, and for whatever reason. So we were prepared when it did close. So I'm just going to go over some topics here, and you'll recognize from my accent that I'm in Southern Vermont. So we recognized that the plant was going to close at some point for whatever reason. And one of the things we urge everybody to think about is that closures may happen with or without notice, depending on the circumstances. It may be that something breaks and the plant just has to shut down, or it may be that financially it just can't perform. That's one of the issues with nuclear now, right? Is the challenge of their being price competitive when they're competing against gas operations. So, but it will close at some point because and that's just kind of the nature of businesses, but also, these are big machines and they have a lifespan. And as you would with any major employer, understand its place in the local economy. Try to engage directly with the plant owner to get information. They may be resistant to do that, but failing that, explore filings with state and federal regulatory agencies, explore trade publications, read stockholder reports, know what they contribute and how the plant is performing, within the fleet of operations, if it's a merchant plant, within a larger family of plants. We got our information about the plant and its place in the economy through participation in state public utility commission dockets, as well as NRC filings. So when the plant closed, we knew where employees lived in 3 adjoining counties in 3 states, and also the towns within. We knew average wages of plant employees relative to the average local prevailing wage. In general, the Vermont Yankee employees tended to earn about double the average wage. We knew about the philanthropic contributions of the plant its employees made, and we knew how the plant intended to decommission, which has a direct impact on the employee loss profile. Understand the plant's role in the social fabric of the community. John and Jim and others spoke about this. Sometimes large businesses will take on significant philanthropic roles, host community events, or provide volunteer hours. And note that it's not just plant employees, but their families and the role those families members have in the community. One of the things I'll note here is that I don't think this is just the case with Vermont Yankee, but others. In some cases, the plants, it's not just nuclear plants, it's other big employers, may take on a lot of the soft roles of just even hosting conversations within the communities. And sometimes when these things close, a lot of soft skills have to be redeveloped. Recognize that unless you've got another operating nuclear facility nearby, many, if not the vast majority of the employees and their families are going to leave the area because they've got a unique skill set that's going to be wanted within a larger industry. There will be impacts on employment, but these are apt to be more indirect. For rural areas especially, the big economic impact is the loss of outsized local incomes and the flow of that money in the economy. Look at filings with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and state boards or commissions to see if the plant discusses whether the plan is to decommission the plant promptly after closure, or if they plan to defer decommissioning. This is known as decon versus safe store. The employment profile is different depending on what the plant chooses to do, and it is the plant's choice. Prompt decommissioning tends to retain current employees longer, whereas deferred decommissioning tends to result in a much faster departure of current employees. And a really important point, don't be afraid to talk about the potential closure of the plant or any other major employer. There is no magic here. Having a rational discussion about the local economy and how to build a diverse, resilient economy and community is the responsible thing to do, and will not cause the employer to close up shop. Discussing the impacts of a potential closure does not mean there's a desire for the operation to close, but I'll note there may be a psychological barrier that you'll have to address, that sometimes folk just don't want to talk about it. I think there's this fear that if you talk about the goose that laid the golden egg, it will leave the nest. They're not going to do that. The scariest aspect of closure of a major employer is not knowing what it means. If you know how many people are employed and where they reside, how much they collectively earn and how that money flows to the local economy, how much the employer contributes to the tax base, and the larger role of the employer in the social fabric of the community, you'll have a picture of what the impacts will be and where to focus your efforts. When it comes to life after a plant closure, look beyond the plant site to the larger community. I believe there's a tendency to look back to the site for a solution, but the reality is that site's going to remain a demolition area for at least 10 years and will be available and won't be available for a much longer period of time if decommissioning is deferred. And last but not least, engage in discussions about the decommissioning and critically non-radiological site restoration. Once the plant has announced it's going to close, the NRC really has, the radiological decommissioning is really largely within its purview, but the non-radiological, that's the other potential hazardous materials that are not radiological in nature, that is clearly within the purview of the state. And it's going to determine whether or not that site is restored to a residential or industrial standard. And the host community has a lot at stake in that discussion. And I'll quit there.
Thanks, Chris. Jen?
Hey, thanks. I am John's former student. And so I was part of a UMass-based research team. And we focused on data, but also the local experience and kind of the psychosocial dynamics of closure from Roe, Vermont Yankee, Plymouth, some other sites that we had the privilege to sort of work in pretty intensively. My perspective today is as a program director in a regional development agency, economic development agency. So we're solely focused on that. And then so Chris is kind of our partner agency. They're the planning commission. Those kind of perspectives inform my takeaways. So I'm going to overlap a little bit with Chris, but I'll try and hone in on a few little model practices that I knew would be kind of specific to our perspective. The first is stay focused on economic planning. The safety and technical stuff matter, but there is dedicated capacity and prescribed processes. There's no required or prescribed process for the economic stuff. Like you have to do it from the local level. You have to drive it. There's also some time wasted on denial and bargaining, kind of like the stages of grief of the closure. And that's fine. I think these are good discussions. Like it is worth talking about why the decommissioning trust fund is, profitable enough for private companies to do the decommissioning and find that worthy, but there wasn't enough money to help with economic mitigation out of that. These are good long-term conversations. Our model practice here around this was many things, but we held, for instance, a great little conference at Landmark College. And it was like the press and funders and local people and state people and federal people. And it was like the first time that people could just get in the room and just have a big economic conversation. And I think that was just a lot of connections or forwards that day. The second is, yes, get data. I'm not going to belabor this point because I actually think people get hung up on the details. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The thing that really got this region started was a locally done study that had good enough information to say, whoa, that's a lot. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of jobs. And a lot is enough to go forward. The third is build bigger partnerships. In Vermont, we started with our first SEDS, our first EDA supported SEDS. It identified the VY closure as a risk even before it had been announced. And that was the first time that it happened nationally. And that sort of gave us something around which to sort of forge shared goals and start to figure out like who's involved in these economic mitigation things. We're going to get more proactive about this stuff. So, a lot of times people ask us how we got a bunch of money in Vermont, and like there's a couple of answers. People like Chris being smart and testifying and getting out there. There's also a technical answer, which is the certificate of public good. That's nudgy, but important. But a lot of it was just like building those coalitions, the information, and just really focusing on the economic stuff and being lucky with the timing that information was in the hands of the governor when it was time to have closure. So as a nuclear community, you're probably used to going it alone a little bit, and this is a behavior change that really takes some deliberacy. The number 4 is keep building, think bigger, and think in decades. Early on with EDA support, we actually did a tri-county. We're at the corner of a state, so it's really 3 counties and 3 states that are affected by the VY closure. And so we had an EDA funded initiative. And Chris especially really is always reminding us to keep thinking at that scale, and that we need to think at that scale. Like, we can't act very effectively just by thinking at the one town or even one little region or county level around here. We also, in terms of thinking bigger, we obsess on leverage. So we got that VY investment, but on the economic piece, there's sort of 10 million for the economic mitigation. And, we've invested that in ways that have brought in 40-something million dollars of extra, public and private equity, and, $50 million of payroll. And so we really are not thinking about how to just spend that money, because we know there's not a lot of other resources coming. More now, thank you to EDA. But number 5, capacity and expertise for economic development matter. And it's a hard thing to face, but if you've had a big nuclear plant in your town or your region, you might not be that great at economic development. You might not have had to be. You might not have had to be that proactive. And it's just an important kind of reckoning to say, we are going to increase our ability to do this kind of work. We, in our second SEDS, our 2019 Comprehensive Economic Development Strategies, actually made that one of our top 5 objectives, is increasing our capacity to do economic development. So it's a difficult thing to say about yourself, but worth facing. And then my 6th thing is, I would show you a bunch of slides if we had all day, but takeaway is start now. It's already probably too late. No, it's not too late, but I mean, really, there's, while you have the plant and you're doing well, is the time to be investing resources in this. So there is no time like the present to face this and to start investing in the future.
Thanks, Jen. So I have a few questions. One that I'd like to ask, maybe both of you can address. One of the things that stands out to me with the work that you did in Southern Vermont was that it was a regional approach. And this clearly is something. The plant may be located in one jurisdiction, but the impacts are across a region. And part of why this is interesting, well, I spent a lot of years in local government, and I know it isn't always easy to get regional things done, at the local level. I wasn't in New England, but I did do my growing up a lot in New England. And I know that is a place with local governments that have a lot of independence and, are used to doing things on their own in many ways. So I would have thought that it was even more challenging to try to do something like this in New England. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about how hard was it? And, is there anything anyone else could get from this, or what they ought to be thinking about in trying to get a region focused on something, which in many cases they may not have thought about, and to get them believing, yeah, we actually do have to get together on this thing. Either you could start.
Chris, I'll let you hit that first, and then I have probably one little pithy thing to throw in. So
Okay. One of the benefits I think we had was the experience in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maine about, other New England states about the impacts of those closures and how those were addressed. But I will say in New England, in Vermont, we have no county government. We have regional
Right.
commissions, which, in our role, we have no authority to do a damn thing. So our role is inherently collaborative. And so part of that may just be our nature. The town of Vernon, where the Vermont Yankee is located, is fiercely independent. And throughout this entire process has remained fiercely independent. But we, along with Brattleboro Credit Corporation, and then our counterparts in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, have collaborated a good bit with one another, really looking at that regional scale, while the town of Vernon has really kind of pursued its more interest within that smaller geography. I'll also note that I think this is an important point. In Vermont, the tax relationship to the plant was only at the hyperlocal level with the town of Vernon and then with the state of Vermont. There was so in other places where you may have county government or other larger units of government, we didn't have that kind of direct relationship to the plant. So just wanted to raise that may have influenced somewhat our capacity and ability to really engage in this kind of plant closure activity, because there wasn't that political fear of what if we make the plant angry and it makes tax negotiations more difficult. I'd still argue you need to do it anyway. Don't be afraid of that. But we didn't have that fear about, well, what if we do something that disrupts that handshake or negotiation relationship we have with the plant.
That's a positive way of spinning that. Yeah. So I'd say when I first, I wasn't here on the ground at that time in this way. So I'm going to just pass along what I think is one of the most important pieces of wisdom that I heard third hand, which was Frank Knott, who was part of a group that helped do that first SEDS, then helped us do that tri-county initiative, Ecovation Hub. I think one of the things he just kept saying here was like, don't wait for permission, like invite to the table who is willing, make it a coalition of the willing. And all that other stuff is going to keep going on in those conversations, but invite in the folks who really care about this and want to do it. And it's been a surprisingly passionate and sustained, and it's been an effective group, and it's evolved over the years. So yeah.
So to elaborate on that a little more, if you can, Jen, specifically from the standpoint of like who you need to get to the table, and if you were starting out and you were thinking about who are the really important folks to get there, and maybe also you had somebody who was an unexpectedly important partner that you learned along the way. But start with, who's really important to try to get to the table.
I think you absolutely have to have all the regional actors at the table. That's just all there is to it. I can't imagine trying to do this. We are small, like little tiny regional agencies. We're not county government. Like we really need each other, and we have the very different relationships and capacities. So that's a given. I think, it depends on what we're talking about, depends on what we're working on, because we're all coming at this from different directions. Chris runs a program that's, Windham Wood Heat. It's an energy, switch over, it's an investment in all different kinds of entities. We run small business programs and workforce programs. And so I think that answer really gets us down to a level of granularity that we probably don't have time for. But I think when it came to the planning piece of it, who needed to be at the table was enough people who cared and represented lots of different parts of the community. And so in that way, for us, that was coincided with, I don't want to imply causality, but it coincided with the kind of formation of really of a grassroots economic development group. So we have been a very traditional kind of real estate driven agency, but SEVED, Southeastern Vermont Economic Development Strategies, was really key in helping bring this forward and make it all possible. And it was more representative of more towns and more different kinds of interests, and public and private. And that definitely was essential. And then of course, big players, big employers, big educational institutions, have the state people there, and the federals. That was our landmark conference. It started with a breakfast that was like each of the regional people, Chris and his counterparts, folks having, an EDA breakfast, and, so building those relationships upwards.
Hey, Chris, can I add one other quick bit of context too?
Sure.
So in 2011, we got nailed by Tropical Storm Irene. And the reason why that's relevant is, that really helped make us pull together, how do we do economic recovery in the face of a disaster that just wrecked our transportation infrastructure, and which is a big deal in an area that's heavily dependent on tourism and other activity. The reason I bring that up is, take advantage of to Jen's point, take advantage of those structures that you've already got that exist, those initiatives and energy that already exist. And I really like her point about the coalition of the willing, and then just try to keep building that coalition over the years. Vermont's small enough, we know not to burn bridges because everybody knows everybody else. So you just keep working on building those relationships over many, many years. This is the long game, not a short game. But use those relationships. If you're not already coming together, it was Irene that really put a fire under the region for the creation of the Southeast Vermont Economic Development Strategies, and to do regional economic development planning in the first place. And then here comes the prospect of Vermont Yankee not getting a renewed license, and that helped drive that. So, use those cues to do work that you need to do to plan for greater economic and community resiliency.
Good. We have a question from the audience, and it says, we have a successful nuclear plant in our local region with no known plans for decommissioning. As a community, it's almost taboo to speak of the plant closing. How do you suggest changing that narrative and starting the process, even with license extensions that might be 10 to 50 years off?
I'll go pithy, Chris, so you can go.
What's that?
I'll always go pithy, so you can go.
So I would just, first, it's a really hard discussion. It's not necessarily an easy discussion to start. With the Windham Regional Commission, the Vermont Yankee was always contentious from day one. We were neutral as to whether or not the plant should continue to operate in part so that we could actually help shepherd conversations between the pro and the anti side. Yep. And the fascinating thing was when we kind of took on this role of a policy role of saying this is what should happen when the plant eventually closes. Those who wanted the plant to close were like, why aren't you advocating for its closure? And then those who really wanted the plant to keep operating were like, why aren't you more aggressively advocating for its staying open? But in the end, all of that kind of tension paid off. I wish I could say there was a magical way to address this, but really look at it. If I don't know what else is in your region as far as employers or in your area, but you need to do this for everything. I mean, honestly, we need to do a better job, frankly, of looking at what do the ski resorts here mean for the local economies that are dependent on them as we deal with sketchier winters and other things like that. So we're talking about nuclear plants here, but do this for anything that has a big impact on your economy. Don't make it just about the nuclear plant. Make it about whatever those influences are on your economy and what can you do to diversify and be more resilient.
Absolutely. So you took my favorite one. So that was perfect. Thank you. Because it is kind of worst practices, and especially in rural economic development, like you cannot afford to be over reliant on one thing. And fear, I wish my friend Jonathan Cooper were here to give you one of his incredibly detailed economic and also time-lapse analyses of the sort of, nuclear plants, because it's very sobering when you start to actually get away from the rhetoric and dig into just the reality. Plants close for lots of reasons. Licenses just don't matter, to a certain extent. And so I think once people start to understand the actual story of the plant closures that have happened already, it wakes people up. So we'd love to give you the fear slideshow someday. But then to flip that around, like identify winners, like start just doing good old fashioned economic development. Like, you want to do some more tech in your community, like get the plant investing in that, get them helping you build the economy now. I mean, no matter what, if it doesn't close for 20 or 30 years, that's great. If it closes in 5, you've gotten started. There's absolutely no downside. And in many ways, there's a tremendous upside to starting now. You don't have to frame it as around closure. It's just really capturing that wealth and that investment.
I think that's such a great point. And it's good advice. As Chris said, you need to do this for everything. This is good advice for any community of any size, really, when it comes to your economy, is that you want to have a diverse portfolio. And more diverse is better because that's lower risk and more likely to ride out any kind of problem that any one part of that might experience. It's more acute when you're particularly dependent on one, but for any community, getting less dependent on any particular, important economic agent is a good thing. So that's just good economic development planning. I know in my community, when I was in local government, we didn't have nuclear situation, but we had a similar situation with BRAC, which is, for those who don't know, the defense facility closure process. And all of a sudden, all these jobs are going and all this space is being vacated. And, you have what used to be a really strong economic center is suddenly in a crisis. And what do you do about that? And if you have, time to plan for that, it's easier to adjust. But, the old advice is still good. The time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. So that's also what I, think that people should take from this is, these may be difficult conversations, but it's important not to be discouraged from having a conversation about your future. And if you can't directly take on the issue with, the C word, then perhaps you could start that by talking about, strengthening the local economy by adding to a diversifying portfolio, building on other assets your community has, which is what you're going to wind up having to do if you do wind up in a crisis, is figure out what those assets are and use those to leverage future economic growth. I do have kind of maybe a more technical or even nerdy question, but considering what we're talking about and the fact that this is EDA related, we may have enough similarly nerdy people in our audience, if I may say, that some of them will not totally glaze over on this. But I did want to ask about the SEDS process and how this fits in. And again, I don't know exactly how that related in your situation, but given that the importance that is overall in economic development planning, particularly with things that relate to working with EDA. Did you have any kind of experience or any advice on incorporating this sort of thing into the SEDS regional economic development planning process?
I mean, Chris, you were really there for the first one, so I think you should speak to it.
Yeah, no, it definitely did. The work had begun. I mean, and the work on developing a comprehensive economic development strategy began even before the Irene impacts. But again, that Irene really kind of lit a fire under that, and then the possibility that the state wouldn't relicense Vermont Yankee further put a fire under that. And then, of course, the actual closure of Vermont Yankee really got the coals going. So it's definitely a good organizing tool, I would say, and it does give you access to EDA resources. And if you look at the one that and the cool thing I think about for us, this may not be a big deal for other areas of the country. I came from places where with county government and where like a regional commission would be multiple counties potentially extending into other states, right? New England's a different critter, but but for us now, our Southeast Vermont economic development strategy has now morphed into a Southern Vermont economic development zone with the goal of becoming an economic development district. And so, again, this has taken about 10 years, but in the long game, it's really important. And it's really, and just through the process of it, it's really helped us, I think, better understand and to recognize economic ties that we have that maybe without going through that process, we wouldn't have recognized as economic ties. Jen, what else do you want to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, and then I'll just like to the nuts and bolts of it. It's like, the SEDS gives us, it's our process of research and, determining implementation steps. What do we want to focus on? So the first SEDS really started to get us focused on the fact that while we needed to replace jobs because the plant was going to take away 600 very highly paid jobs, very highly paid for this region, it also, showed us that we needed people. And that seems kind of crazy, but in rural people get this, right? We can lose jobs and people, and that's actually a double whammy. That's not a good thing, right? So that's, and then where do we go from that? We start talking about like, what would workforce programs look like? And so the SEDS has been the germ, for us to develop all kinds of programs and initiatives, that then come back and we draw other people in. We do our SEDS project process pretty vigorously. We kind of go out into the community and we don't just make a list sitting here in this office. We go ask people what they're doing. So we try to have situational awareness, and we, between our two agencies, and so it's a constant kind of like discursive process between the communities and the private sector and it's the thing that brings us all back together. And it's like, okay, well, what are the priority projects based on what we said we wanted to get done in the SEDS, and who's going to do it? And if nobody, maybe it's one of our agencies. And it frames a constant dynamic program. And when we talk about and use our SEDS every single day, I mean, I am right now, a lot of my time goes into welcoming new Americans to this region. That grew out of 10 years ago, identifying new people. We don't get immigration in this region. And we have slowly and steadily built towards the point where we helped welcome a new refugee resettlement agency, the first, rurally sited refugee agency, and second, Wisconsin's doing one too. So that's a really big deal. Like, that's a really tangible. There are 100 human beings here from Afghanistan who are the result of this process, and that's just one little example of what our SEDS does. So,
Chris, can I add one other tiny bit of context?
Sure.
So the last question just kind of put my kind of gave me pause. So understand, like Vermont Yankee, they closed right after getting their license extensions from the state and the feds, and they had just done a refueling campaign. So that frankly means nothing. At some level, I wondered if they kind of continue that process, because there's a really important federal suit between the state of Vermont and the state and the federal government over who had the ability to ultimately control whether or not a plant could continue operation. But the other thing, though, was as a part of our research, we were looking at, in the prior dockets, we were looking at like some of the deferred maintenance on the plant, how much money they were going to have to put into keeping the plant operating, but also looking at trade publications, like how was that plant performing in this region and in this electricity market. So we were kind of scratching our heads. So at some level for us, it wasn't a surprise at all that they closed. We weren't rooting for that, but it was more like, this just, we know we're going through this process, but economically, this thing is not looking particularly viable. And I would argue, do that for everything. I mean, I can tell you, we're looking at Vail and Aspen holdings here about how well are they investing in our ski resorts or not? What are the signs that we're seeing? We have an important company here, GS Precision. They're accumulating other companies, building. That's good for us to know. So do that with all of your industries, but especially that nuclear plant.
Well, this has been a really great conversation. Thanks, Chris and Jen. I'd like to keep going, but we have other programming and we've run out of our time for this segment. So thank you very much for this insight into your experience in Vermont. Really appreciate it.